Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 2. Today, in this module, we will talk about the emotional resilience of LGBTQI plus individuals. More specifically, we will talk about what resilience is, and we will talk about the main key points of the resilience framework. We will explore how it is applicable to the LGBTQI plus community and the experiences of the LGBTQI plus individuals. We will go through some strategies on how to build resilience. And in the end, we will talk about the reflection activity, which is done in pairs, but we can also adapt it for individual use. First of all, before we start, it's important to think about what resilience is. This is the first thing that most of the people think about it when they hear this word. Most of us think about endurance, about struggle, strength, the ability to cope. Some people think about community also, and our ability to adapt and bounce back, and of course about power or resistance. But these are all correct. These are all meanings related to resilience, but in our specific context, we are talking about the theoretical framework, which was introduced in the 70s in the field of social psychology. The main question that the researchers wanted to answer is why people react the way they do when they face adversities, and what things affect these outcomes. The research started and focused on children, firstly, who faced elevated risks to manifest mental health challenges, and then they broadened the spectrum. The main thing that was introduced newly then was actually this shift in the discourse from the individual pathological traits to societal factors. Because until then, when some person manifested some mental health challenges, they always focused on what kind of pathological traits this person has. But now the discourse started to shift slowly to how the society impacts mental health. But first of all, how do we define resilience in this context? It is the capacity to adapt and recover from some difficult or stressful or traumatic experience. Furthermore, we also examine the way that positive and negative factors, and in this case, these factors are named protective and risk factors, the way they interplay and influence this ability in a dynamic and ever-evolving process. It is important to remember a few things, though, when we are thinking in these terms. First of all, when we are talking about a dynamic process, it is also obvious that resilience is not a static and inherited personal trait. It can be fostered through the cultivation of these factors and the resources. Also, it's also important to remember that resilience is understood as the ability to adapt and cope better than expected. So it's always relative. There's no golden standard about where the bar of resilience is, and it's also it has to do with how about what kind of adversities we're talking about. It's different if we're talking about the war and famine and homelessness and poverty. These are different situations that people have to adapt and recover from. So it's always relative to the kind of adversities that people are facing. A very, very important note to remember is that we have to be very careful not to normalize the structural injustices in order to, when we're using this kind of framework, like asking marginalized groups to adapt to adversity instead of challenging and changing these harmful environments and institutions. It's very easy in this individualistic and neoliberal age that we're living in that we can focus on the individual, on the marginalized group, and talk about this kind of things without talking about the structural injustices, but these kind of marginalizations and traumas and stress factors don't just happen in the void. And we have to be very careful in the way that we practice this kind of strategies, that we don't normalize the injustice. And it's also important to remember that communities also manifest a kind of resilience in a similar manner as individuals, and we will talk about this in depth at the end. So, first of all, what are protective and risk factors? The positive, so say the protective factors, and the negative, the risk factors, are the factors that interplay and influence the ability of recovering from a difficult or traumatic situation. Some protective factors can act as buffers or can mitigate some negative effects. So the protective factors can be either attributes or conditions that help overcome adversity. They are either internal resources, dispositional internal resources like self-esteem or self-regulation, or they can be societal environmental resources like the peer relationships, the positive peer relationships the peer has, the safe community environment. Protective factors can act as buffers when some adversity happens, or they can act in a way that the adversity does not manifest at all. Risk factors are conditions and attributes that increase the likelihood of negative outcomes, and again we are talking either about internal dispositional factors related to personal traits like difficulty of emotional regulation or low self-esteem. It can be familial, like family conflict, low level family acceptance, and of course again external societal and environmental like poverty or discrimination. Now we will talk a little bit more about how emotional resilience relates to the experiences of the LGBTQI plus youth. It's no secret that the LGBTQI plus community has, and in some cases is still facing criminalization, pathologization, and discrimination in various aspects of life. Especially if we think about how the trans rights, the rights of the trans community are being attacked in the moment globally. And for example, we can see this kind of discrimination. And of course, LGBTQI youth can be more vulnerable, mainly due to lack of resources. And this relates directly to being a young person as well as LGBTQI plus. This lack of resources can be internal, like lack of coping mechanisms, because as a young person you may not have had the time to establish these coping mechanisms, or external, like financial independence and rigid social relationships that can help out in a difficult moment. We will go through some risk factors and then some protective factors that are specifically faced by LGBTQI plus youth. Firstly, one of the biggest things that an LGBTQI plus young person may face is family rejection, or in general low family support. Of course, the experiences of discrimination and stigma and minority stress, and the high likelihood of victimization and bullying, and general verbal, physical, or sexual abuse. All these things can also lead to social isolation and poor peer relationships, especially if we're talking about LGBTQI plus young people who live in rural areas where they may be isolated from general LGBTQI community or more open-minded people. There is a high risk for homelessness, a disproportionate high risk for homelessness for queer youth, and poverty. And of course, if you are always exposed to non-affirming and unsafe environments at your home, at your school, or at your work. Some protective factors can be social support, acceptance by family, and even acceptance and support by one trusted adult can make a huge difference in how you perceive yourself and in your mental health outcomes. Positive portrayals of LGBTQI plus persons generally, in the terms of role models young people can look up to. Access to supportive communities, they can be either physical or online. Access to affirming health and mental health services. And of course, inclusive and safe environments, access to inclusive and safe environments. And now we will go through some strategies about how to build resilience. These are ways to cultivate factors which promote resilience. Some of these can be more general and are applicable to the general population as well. Some are more specifically for LGBTQI young people. First of all, the creation of healthy coping mechanisms is something that we as youth workers do strive to do. Coping mechanisms are the conscious and voluntary mobilization of acts, both thoughts and behaviors, to reduce or tolerate stress. And they can be broken down into 4 major categories. They can be either problem-focused, emotional-focused, cognitive-focused, or support-seeking. They're depending on the person, the young person, and the situation. Different kind of coping mechanism may be more useful. Problem-focused mechanisms are focusing obviously in problem solution. The emotional focused are focusing mostly on the emotional impact of the adversity the person is facing, and how to mitigate this kind of stress and impact, emotional impact. Cognitive and meaning focused are focusing in the way that we interpret it and narrate the problem that we are facing, and how we can shift this narration to a more useful perspective. And support seeking is focused on how to seek support in order to armor ourselves in a difficult situation. Next, cultivating emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is useful for everyone to have. It is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage one's own emotions, as well as empathize with others. It's we generally, our society does not focus enough on emotional intelligence. We're always talking about our IQ, but not enough about EQ. We can focus on, as youth, focus on self-awareness in order to magnify the ability to recognize and understand our own emotions, both emotional management, social awareness, and relationship skills are all sides of emotional intelligence that youth workers can work on with young people in order to help cultivate emotional intelligence. Building positive LGBTQI plus identity is important. It's always important to remember that often young LGBTQI plus people are still formatting their identities. They're exploring and they're trying to embrace the different facets of them. This is a very important progress and process, and it's vital for self-esteem, confidence, and a general strong sense of self and pride. If this process goes well, it helps counter internalized stigma as well. So, in this stage, if the young person has guidance and affirming approach, positive narratives of LGBTQI plus stories, and generally representation media and role models, these are all important aspects that can help to form a strong and proudful sense of self. Building social relationships. Strong social relationships can be a source of emotional and practical support. It's always a place to go back to if something goes wrong or some difficulty arises and some problem arises that we have not expected. It's important to remember that even one meaningful relationship with a supportive adult can significantly lower the risk of suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. And it's helpful as youth workers to help LGBTQI plus young people to actively seek out people who have a positive outlook on LGBTQI plus identities and issues, or who are part of the community themselves. Obviously, that doesn't always make a person a good person to be part of the community or have a positive stance on LGBTQI plus issues. But it is important to start off from a level where you know that your LGBTQI plus identity is safe, or the whole questioning and forming your identity is something that can be affirmed by your people you're surrounded. As youth workers, another thing that we can do to help foster emotional resilience is help connect with the LGBTQI plus community. This can be done by seeking out, help people to seek out and participate in community events, which helps to negate the feeling of isolation and also strengthens the sense of pride and belonging. LGBTQI plus community spaces are usually a safe space to further explore and understand one's identity. And you can relate to other people's experiences as well and find support, peer support. And we should always remember that not physical communities are always accessible, especially in rural areas and in smaller towns. And in these cases, there are online communities And of course, in some cases, physical communities are not the thing that the person may seek, so an online community can also be a protective factor. For some people, active participation in the LGBTQI plus community can strengthen can act as a protective factor, because engaging in activism, in advocacy, and in community building creates a sense of agency and purpose. So, and also by doing so, you always develop skills and coping mechanisms that can improve also the problem-solving capacities. It is a way to create valuable social connections and relationships as well. And the sense of purpose of improving the lives of all the LGBTQI plus people and the general standard of living of the LGBTQI plus community also helps the individuals as well. So for a lot of people, after they come out, after they start having contact with the community, the active participation in the terms of activism can act as a protective factor. So, as I said in the beginning, resilience in LGBTQI plus communities also manifest in similar ways, but also kind of different. In the communities, you have a common sense of belonging and the shared identity and the common sense of pride. It is also a way to access to resources and informal aid networks, because communities try to create and foster this kind of networks and resources in order to make them more accessible to all the people of the community. We have already discussed activism, and the sense also where sometimes communities also develop affirming services which strengthen the general resilience of the members of the community. And in a cultural way, the sharing of narratives of non-heteronormative and non-cis-normative stories and lives also cultivate a way of thinking and a perspective that is outside of the heteronormative and cis-normative way of imagining things how they could be. So there's also this cultural shift where people start to actually belong and imagine their lives in their fullest. So the activity is stories of resilience. It can be adapted in an individual activity as well. The main point is to think of the story of a stressful event that you may have experienced. It doesn't have to be traumatic for the objective of this activity, and you will try to identify the obstacles that made the situation more difficult, and of course the available resources and the ways that you manage to overcome the difficulty. When you have mapped everything out, you can think about it, how, if any strategies stand out, and if now in retrospective you did anything that surprised you, or you think you did good there, that you didn't expect that from yourself, and you can write it down as well. So thank you everyone for your attendance, and hope to see you soon.